My name is Blake Chair. I'm a Dairy Development Officer based in Port Macquarie, and I'll be facilitating today's meeting. Before we start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aborigine and Torres Strait Islanders people here today. Also, just some housekeeping comments. Everyone is on mute to eliminate background noise, so please stay on mute until question time. Feel free to use the chat tab that allows you to submit questions or comments to us throughout the webinar. To ask questions, we'll hold off to the end of presentations, but feel free to write in the chat and raise your hand as we go, and we'll answer those questions at the end. If we can't answer all the questions, we'll follow up after the event by email, and we are recording this meeting, which will be available after the presentation. But if you do have any questions or concerns about that, please feel free to reach out. We have an hour for today's session and want to make sure that we keep things to time so everyone can continue on with their day. The purpose of today's session is to present the results from the Dairy Up Project 3 and provide an update on the New South Wales Dairy Development Planning and Environmental Guidelines. Today we are joined by Sheena Carter from our DPI Dairy team, who will present the results from the Dairy Up Project 3, which is looking at the economics of intensification. Thanks, Sheena. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Blake. Thanks very much to everyone who has joined us this morning for this presentation. I've done various versions of this over the journey of the project, but this is the final look at the results for this particular project, which falls, as Blake has mentioned, under the large body of work known as Dairy Up Research Development and Extension Program in New South Wales, which is being led by the University of Sydney's Dairy Research Foundation. So this particular project was undertaken with joint funding from Dairy Australia and New South Wales DPI, and it also complements a body of work undertaken by Agriculture Victoria in Northern Victoria. So one of the reasons for the project was the increased interest that we are seeing throughout the industry in intensive systems. And we know these systems, they require a lot of capital investment and they come with their own risks. Up until this point, there's been an absence of information that's specific to Australia on the profitability and performance of these systems. So this project for New South Wales and the Northern Victorian project are really providing us with some baseline data to help farmers in their decision making and considerations when they're looking at these systems. What I would just like to do before we get into the presentation is just be clear on what we're talking about when I'm referring to intensification. So Dairy Australia has a feeding systems, 1 to 5 feeding systems, and it starts on the left-hand side where we have predominant pasture. The diet is predominantly pasture in the milker herd diet. There's a little bit of concentrate in the diet that's fed in the bale, but as we move to the right through these systems, we start to see more concentrate being fed in the bale. Then we get to a point where we've got a PMR or a partial mixed ration, where some of that forage is being fed on a feed pad. They're still being fed concentrate in the bale. Then we get to system 4, which is a hybrid system, where we're seeing much less time on pasture with cows grazing. They're fed partial mixed ration for probably the vast majority of the year, is still concentrate fed in the bale. And then we get to system 5, which is zero grazing. So essentially cut and carry silage being fed as part of a total mixed ration fed within the milker herd diet. So there's no grazing at this point. And it tends to include some sort of housing facilities. So we now have the national guidelines for feed pads and contained housing systems, which was released this year by Dairy Australia. And under their classification system, we have 3 types of housing facilities, which are referred to as a dry lot system on the left, a loose housing system in the middle, which people probably would be more familiar with compost barn type terminology, and then free stall systems on the right hand side, where cows have individual stalls to go back to. So the project involved a couple of components. There was an economic study where we used the dairy farm monitor input sheets to analyse the performance of these businesses, their profitability, and understand cost structures within these systems. And by using the Dairy Farm Monitor methodology, that has enabled us to look at the TMR farm performance relative to New South Wales Dairy Farm Monitor. And we must be mindful that in this study, we are looking at 7 farms in New South Wales. So it's a small data set, 7 anonymous farms that are located essentially from the Queensland border down to the Victorian border. So if you were to draw a line sort of from northeast New South Wales down towards the Riverina region on a diagonal, that's generally where our farms are located. So they're predominantly inland farms, and you'll understand that New South Wales is a big state. Within that area, we've got different climatic zones, and we've also got different milk pricing structures throughout those regions as well. We also commissioned the University of Melbourne to undertake a social science study. This involved interviewing TMR farmers and also consultants who engage with businesses looking to intensify or operating TMR systems. And there was also an online survey for New South Wales farmers to help understand people's attitudes towards intensification, their intent towards intensification, and with the TMR farmers, what some of the triggers were for them to fully intensify their system, some of the challenges they had, and where they've accessed information or where there's an absence of information when they're on that journey. So as a result of the project, we've obviously got this baseline data around the farm profitability. And I would also like to mention that we have 6 years of data at this point, and 6 challenging years. And there's been, at the beginning of the 6 years, there were only a couple of farms in that data set. But for the last 3 years, we've had the full 7 farms within the data set. We've generated some case studies which will be available shortly on farms that have intensified and the reasons, the challenges they've had, which will be available on the Dairy Up website. And Dairy Australia have, in conjunction with Agriculture Victoria, released the national guidelines for feed pads and contained housing systems, and also more recently a farm system evaluator, which are 2 excellent resources for people that are considering intensifying their system, and it helps sort of guide their thinking and decision making. So why the project? Look, it's I think we're all quite aware that there's a lot of interest across the industry in intensification for various reasons. The survey of New South Wales farmers by the University of Melbourne indicated that predominantly it's an adaptation strategy. And by adaptation, we had sort of 61% of the respondents indicated that it's things like changing climatic conditions and extreme weather events that are really getting people thinking about these systems. There's also, they identified external triggers and internal motivators. So the external triggers are things outside of farmers' control, such as milk price input costs, the climatic conditions, those kind of things, other government policies. And the motivators are more internal triggers. So some farmers have got a desire to look at improving things like animal welfare, increasing milk and feed productivity, and also environmental sustainability, worker environment or worker conditions with more routine type activities for staff, and also access to land. So the farmer survey also indicated that it's farmers not wanting to intensify their systems because they're happy with the current system and operation that they have, or they might see these type of systems as being too high in terms of capital investment, or it's just not the right change for the business. This slide is care of Scott McDonald from Agriculture Victoria, and it just illustrates the increase in interest in Australia. So Scott's data set is Australia-wide, not just Victorian. And Scott is obviously only one person who's closely involved with farmers in their intensification journey and planning. But we can see, you know, there's a clear trend over the last 10 years or so on the level of inquiry, and the online survey for farmers in New South Wales indicated that 53% of respondents in New South Wales to that survey are looking to intensify or further intensify their system in New South Wales, and a third of those respondents were actually considering a non-grazing or a TMR system. I think the intensification journey isn't a simple one, as our TMR farmers have experienced. You know, those that have gone down the journey already, they're faced with lots of hurdles and lots of challenges. It's a big decision, and there's lots that needs to be factored in. So it's very context specific, and by that I mean different businesses have different starting points. So some businesses start with a greenfield site and develop from scratch, whereas others, it's more an incremental process. They might sort of start with an earthen feed pad, develop into a concrete feed pad, put a roof over it, then start thinking about some sort of housing infrastructure. There's lots of incremental decisions and processes that come with this along the way, whether they're purchasing more land, they're changing their system, they're having to grow crops rather than graze pasture, they're looking at purchasing more machinery and often irrigation infrastructure as well. So this comes with new complexities in these systems that perhaps haven't been experienced in a pasture-based system. What type of housing facility are we going to build, and have I got the management skills required for fodder production, management within the shed, effluent, all that type of thing. And it requires a lot of support that's specific to the individual in the region in which they live, and this can be challenging to find. Often we see farmers going out of Australia to find some of this advice, but I think our Australian information is getting better with time and experience. The University of Melbourne also identified that there's lots of pause points along this journey. So, there's planning with councils for permits, selection of housing facility, the effluent system that you're going to use, development of environmental plans, securing the capital to invest in the system, constructing the system, all that project management that goes with that. And so it's quite intense. And one farmer was quoted that was surveyed as saying, so basically trying to design a facility and then go through council, then we get out the other end before we could start construction was basically 2 years. And then with all the things that are going on in planning and developing the system that they're going to move to, for lots of farmers, they're still operating the existing business they have. And one of the farmers said, so it's starting to add up and take a toll, just the constant decision making challenges that were coming up, as well as running the existing business as they had it. I've mentioned management to a degree. So management ability and skills to operate these systems are different to pasture-based systems. And it's a bit of a transition journey to get up to speed, I think, quite quickly. So through the survey of the consultants by the University of Melbourne, they identified some key areas of management that are kind of new once you enter these systems. Obviously, if you've got a loose housing system, there's the management of the bedding. You've got feed pads in these systems that you need to manage and manage well daily, multiple times a day. You've got the herd nutrition and transition cow management, which needs close attention to detail, and lots of, I guess, the use of nutritionists, whether they're Australian based or US based, seems to be quite common amongst the farmers. There's the effluent system maintenance. Your feed, this is hugely important. Storage of your feed, quality of that, your feed inventory management, and basically, you're no longer managing pastures. You've essentially become a cropping farmer and operator, which is a different skill set. And then obviously new roles within the business for staff, new routines that need to be understood, feed management, feed ration formulation or mixing of feed rations, etc. So, and the quote down the bottom is by one of the consultants who said it's taken, referring to clients, it's taken them longer to get the benefit out of the system than they thought. So there's this transition period where you're trying to adapt quickly to the new system. And if you're not doing this quickly and effectively, there's lost opportunity within the business in terms of animal performance production, which obviously comes with flow-on effects related to milk income and other challenges. So it is a big area that needs to be focused on and well understood. Before we look at some of the actual features in terms of the economic performance, looking at our data set of 7 farms, there are some key features of these farms that I have pulled out from the data set. So the consistently profitable businesses have been the well-established businesses. I mentioned earlier that we've got some farms in that transition phase where there are challenges in that phase, and particularly in the years where we've been through those 6 years where we've had the impact of drought as the major challenge. So the more profitable ones or consistently profitable ones tend to be the well-established businesses. They have strategic income diversification, and I'll explain this in another slide, but they've got a higher amount of income derived from livestock trading and from feed and water sales, but predominantly feed sales rather than water sales. They tend to have efficient and productive cows, and by efficient, I'm referring to an industry measure where we look at the kilograms of milk solids produced per kilo of cow live weight. So we're aiming for 1 kilo of milk solids per kilo of cow live weight. That's a 100% efficient cow. And some of these farms are much more efficient than 100%, as well as producing large quantities of milk per cow. They manage their feed source really well. So they're largely self-sufficient with fodder and crops, or they've got a reliable external source of fodder, or they have access to unique byproducts, which are a feature of where their business is located. And we do see that quite a lot of these businesses aim to store up to 2 years worth of silage or feed inventory in front of them as a risk management strategy. They do have good overhead cost control within these businesses, and they're constantly looking to identify areas to improve the business. They don't enter a TMR system and stop there. There's lots of tweaks and things that they do to keep improving their system. If we look at the results of the analysis, so the red line is the TMR farms, and the blue lines, the dark blue line is New South Wales Dairy Farm Monitor farms, and we also have the top 25% New South Wales Farm Monitor farms. So any farms that are TMR farms that participate in Dairy Farm Monitor have been removed from the Farm Monitor data set. So we've got distinct groups here when we're looking at the differences between them. This graph is obviously of their production per cow per year over the 6-year period. And we can see quite clearly that the TMR farms do have higher production per cow than our Farm Monitor farms. You might expect this, this is sort of sitting around an average of 8,500 litres. Again, it's contexting the data. We've got some of the farms that have been operating these systems for a while producing in excess of 10,000 litres per cow. But where we've got these businesses that are transitioning and they haven't quite realised the potential benefits of the system, they're not quite at that level yet. And with time, we would probably expect them to increase that with management and genetics. If we look at land area, I've already mentioned the geographical location of these businesses, the 7 businesses. So they're inland farms that have got access to much more land than our farm monitor farms. So, and given that farm monitor farms we could consider to be more coastal farms where land is much more expensive than what we see in inland regions. All land is very expensive at the moment, but in this case, our coastal land can be worth up to 3 times the amount per hectare as what we're seeing with our inland farms. So they do tend to have much more land available to them. Profitability. So in this instance, I am talking about earnings before interest and tax, or EBIT. So EBIT is calculated by our gross farm income, taking away the operational costs, which are our variable and overhead costs. So there are cash costs in this and non-cash costs as well, things such as depreciation and imputed labour. So this graph shows us that over that 6-year period, the profitability of the TMR farms has been comparable to the farm monitor farms in New South Wales. Once we've got our EBIT, I should have mentioned this as well. After EBIT is what is left to pay interest and lease costs in the business principal, any capital expenditure and tax. So that's our EBIT. Then if we move to our return on total assets, this is a business efficiency measure. How well is the business using all the resources available to them? And in Dairy Farm Monitor, we're looking at owned resources and leased resources. So our return on total assets managed is our EBIT divided by the value of all those resources. So we see a bit of a divergence here where on a return on total assets basis, the TMR farms appear to be more profitable than our DFMP farms. This needs to be contexted with what I mentioned earlier around things like land values. So this impacts the return on total assets, particularly for our farm monitor data set, where we've got land that's up to 3 times more expensive than inland farms. And in the data set, just to illustrate this issue, we had one farm monitor farm in the 2021 year that had an earnings before interest and tax of $2.90 per kilo milk solids. This translated into a 3.3% return on total assets. At the same time, we had a TMR farm that had a $2.64 EBIT, and that translated into a 7.3% return on total assets. But look, essentially the message is these systems are just as profitable as other systems in New South Wales, and they're not as profitable as our top 25% farm monitor farms, but they are profitable. This slide shows our just sort of highlights that TMR farms aren't immune to the impacts of drought. So we're looking at return on total assets on the left, the 18-19 and 19-20 financial years, which most of you will recall were pretty horrendous years with the impacts of drought. So the 18-19 year for New South Wales was the lowest year in terms of profitability in all years of Dairy Farm Monitor. And we can see the impact. We've got some outlier farms in this data set, which their performance is primarily driven for the TMR farm by exposure to the purchased feed market. So they've been in a transition phase, highly exposed to the purchased feed market, which you'll recall was very expensive, very difficult to access, and you know, the quality wasn't necessarily always the best as well. So that really impacted their performance. The 1920 year, we see an increase in profitability, but that was primarily driven by increase to milk price rather than a reduction in costs, because feed costs were still very high at that point. And so again, we sort of see this wide range in profitability, primarily as a result of the exposure to the feed market. Our top 25% farms, we see they are obviously more profitable, but they're consistent. The range in their profitability is much less. If we look at gross farm income, so gross farm income is calculated from, it's obviously milk income, which makes up the bulk of our gross farm income. We've also got livestock trading profit, feed and water sales, and other farm-related income. So this graph is indicating that gross farm income between the TMR farms and farm monitor farms is somewhat similar, but there is variation in the makeup of that gross farm income. So this bar graph here illustrates the proportion. The red is the milk income for TMR farms on the left, farm monitor in the middle, and top 25% farms on the right. So the dark blue is our livestock trading profit. The light blue is feed and water sales, which is predominantly feed sales rather than water, and the grey is other farm income. So if we look at livestock trading profit and feed and water sales combined, for the TMR farms, that has averaged about 15.1% of their gross farm income, compared to a combined total of 9.2% for farm monitor and 10.2% for our top 25% farms. So this is indicating, you know, some strategic income diversification through livestock trading, feed sales, which is, you know, partially due to the geographical location and the land area available to these farmers in these systems. So gross farm income minus our variable costs and overhead costs gives us our EBIT. Our variable costs are made up of herd and shed costs and feed costs. If we looked at herd and shed costs, there's no real difference between the TMR farms and the farm monitor farms, and it tends to make up a smaller proportion of our variable costs compared to our feed costs, which are always our biggest cost in a dairy business. So here we can see the TMR farms, and this instance is again the drought, and the total feed cost in terms of dollars per kilo milk solids was very high in our TMR farms, particularly driven by those farms that were significantly exposed to that purchase fodder market at the time. So, you know, there's a vulnerability there that we need to be very mindful of, particularly in that transition phase. And feed costs include purchased and homegrown feed as well. If we look at labour costs, so total labour costs, and this refers to both paid and imputed labour. So imputed labour being the owner-operator labour, which we put a standard value on to enable direct comparisons between farms. If we look at our farm monitor farms, their total labour costs are somewhat higher than our TMR farms. The TMR farms tend to have much more paid labour in the business compared to imputed labour, which is, you know, partially due to the number of labour units involved in the business. It requires more labour units. So we've got 7.5 on average, 7.5 full-time equivalent labour units on our TMR farms, compared to about 4.5 in our farm monitor and nearly 5.5 in the top 25%. So obviously, you know, these are businesses that have got, on average, larger herd sizes, and they've got that cropping and fodder production component to their business, which requires more labour units. We do see that the TMR farms tend to be slightly more efficient with their labour than the farm monitor farms, but not quite as efficient as our top 25% farms. Other costs of interest in terms of overhead costs, repairs and maintenance. We didn't see a great deal of difference between the TMR farms and farm monitor farms in New South Wales. I think this is due to a couple of factors in New South Wales. So one is in New South Wales, a lot of dairies have a feed pad of some sort, whether that is because they're in a partial mixed ration system, which we have a lot of in that system, or it's just for opportunistic use throughout the year, periods when there's feed gaps and they use a feed pad. Then if you have a feed pad, you still have the associated equipment used for feeding out. That still comes with repairs and maintenance, regardless of the frequency of use. The other issue is around the dairy industry in New South Wales is becoming more and more dispersed, and access to contractors in a timely manner can become a challenge for many farmers. And so we see farmers are trying to get rid of that risk of not getting silage and hay made when they need it made to get the quality they need. And so they are investing in their own machinery for paddock work and for fodder conservation. So that obviously comes with repairs and maintenance as well. The other one was depreciation. So in the first 5 years of the project, depreciation was pretty similar between the farm monitor farms and the TMR farms. So this was partly due to the methodology used in Dairy Farm Monitor, where we have a category called land and associated assets. And within that associated assets was the building and the infrastructure, the sheds, etc., used within TMR systems and also within pasture-based systems as well. But being land, in the land category, obviously we don't depreciate land. It does completely the opposite. It appreciates in value. So in the 21-22 year, depreciation was handled differently for significant buildings. So we now have a category called significant buildings. So we can account for the depreciation of that infrastructure, and it's depreciated over an assumed lifespan of 20 years. So the impact of this in the 21-22 financial year was that we did see a 36% increase on depreciation cost for our TMR farms on the previous year. We still saw the impact in our farm monitor farms as well, but obviously not as high as our TMR farms. So just some key messages from all of that. The intensification journey really it's a complex and it's a protracted journey to embark on. You need to do lots of research and talk to other farmers and get a good team behind you. TMR farms have comparable profitability to our farm monitor farms within New South Wales. They tend to have more strategic business diversification in terms of that gross farm income, risk management strategy, and they have a different skill set that comes with them for management. And most importantly, I think this is one of the very key messages: feed-based management and security is vitally important in these businesses. It's going to be your biggest cost and your biggest risk. So it needs to be understood. You need to understand how much feed you're going to need, where you're going to get that feed from, and costs and impact of that. And this is a great quote from one of the farmers interviewed, where he said, people think of intensive dairy, the first thing they think of is building a barn. It's actually a whole system, and we've intensified our cropping side as well as the dairy part of it, the barn, the housing, and all that sort of thing. So it's not just a shed. As a result of this project, we will have some case studies and fact sheets shortly available on the Dairy Up website. I've already mentioned the national guidelines for feed pads and contained housing systems, which was released this year, and the farm system evaluator tool, which are both available on the Dairy Australia website. And this is kind of a nice segue into Blake, who will be speaking next on the New South Wales Environmental Management Guidelines, which are currently being updated. And it's been a long time since they have been updated. So that'll be a great resource for New South Wales farms. But in just wrapping up, I would sincerely like to thank the 7 farms that have participated in this project for the economic analysis. They are anonymous, but they've been incredibly generous in providing us with that information to give us that baseline data set. I'd also like to thank the farmers and service providers who were interviewed by the University of Melbourne's team, and those farmers that participated in our online survey as well to help us understand this space a little better and be able to quantify it. So thanks, Blake, or Zita.
Thank you, Sheena. That was excellent. I just had a look at the chat. We didn't have any questions come through, but yeah, any questions, feel free to take yourself off mute and yeah, fire away.
I've just got a quick question, actually, Sheena. So you've been collecting the 7 farms over the last 3 years, is that right? Do you have plans to continue collecting their data? Because I mean, it's a really good and interesting data set. And if we see more intensive systems pop up in New South Wales, I don't know, is that something that you'd like to collect longer term, or will they just be integrated into Dairy Farm Monitor, ideally?
No, so there's look, there is strong interest in continuing this data set for lots of reasons, including what you've said, but also to sort of understand that transition journey and how that pans out with time. At the moment, Dairy Australia and Agriculture Victoria are funding another project, so we will get another year's worth of data for New South Wales farms as well as part of that project in a contained housing system. So Agriculture Victoria have 7 northern Victorian farms that they've collected data for that same time period that we have. And as a result of this continuation of the data collection, we'll have, for New South Wales, we'll have a 7th year, and AgVic will also have 7 years of data. And look, I know, speaking with Karen Romano from Dairy Australia, I'm not sure if she's on the call today, but there is certainly interest from Dairy Australia in continuing this as well.
Awesome, thank you, Sheena. Any other questions?
Jane's got her hand up. Is it Jane?
There's a question in the chat from Greg Blake.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, Blake, just a quick one from me, Sheena. Fascinating insights on many levels, lot to digest. Particularly interested in the necessity or the skill attribute of those TMR farmers around building 2 years worth of feed inventory, and just all of the challenges that would come with that. So that's for established TMR businesses, or are you talking sort of about businesses in transition?
That's a good question. And yeah, again, I guess to expand on your question, obviously building up a feed inventory of that size, it comes at a significant cost to the business, but it's a cost that these businesses are willing to wear as a risk management strategy and not being exposed to purchase feed prices, often in those drought years. Is it the more established businesses or those transitioning? Certainly the more established businesses, most of them do, but certainly one of the farms in the transition phase has made a conscious decision to do that as well, just because of the risk that they've found themselves exposed to, really around when they didn't have access to water. If that answers your question.
Yep, absolutely does. Fascinating insight, especially around the impact to cash flow, right? So yeah, just a really good learn. Fascinating. Thanks, Sheena.
Thanks, Greg. Was that a different one in the chat, or is that still the same? Oh no, it's a welcome. Thanks.
That's excellent. Oh, well, thank you very much, Sheena. That was really insightful, and yeah, as you briefly mentioned, hopefully this presentation will lead in quite nicely especially around trying to make a bit of a streamlined process for farmers looking to make these intensification changes on farm. So I'll just share my screen. Hopefully we can see that okay. Excellent, and a few thumbs up. Yeah, thank you. So this discussion will be around the providing an update on the New South Wales Dairy Development Planning and Environmental Guidelines. And I'd just like to acknowledge that this project's currently being funded out of the Storm and Flood Industry Recovery Program under Program 3E. And the people involved with this project are Marguerite White. So she's the lead consultant from ICD Project Services. We have the DPI Dairy team with myself and Zeta as program manager, and the agricultural land use planning team within DPI, which we also have Lillian Parker on today. So the guidelines were last updated in 2008, and during the past 15 years, we've seen a significant change in the New South Wales planning and environmental regulatory framework. We have also seen the evolution of modern dairy farming systems and advancements in pest management practices, while also seeing an increased demand towards housing cows or installing infrastructure to support better feed utilisation and animal welfare on farm. Issues have arisen with farmers across the state about the length of time it has taken for development applications to process, while also understanding that not all information has been provided to the council up front. We have identified that there is a need to upskill both farmers on the information required and the council on the different types of processes of different types of purposes of dairy infrastructure. With the new environmental guidelines, we endeavour to ensure that this is a streamlined process for both farmer and council, and that both parties have the information needed. Some of the key outcomes of the project will be that guidelines that better reflect modern dairy systems. They will also be New South Wales specific, and where possible, we will not be looking to duplicate industry information that is already published, but instead signpost to different publications such as the Dairy Australia National Guidelines for Dairy Feed Pads and Containers and Contained Housing, which was recently released. We will respond to changes to the New South Wales Planning and Environmental Regulatory Framework and promote the advancements in dairy industry best practice from contained housing all the way through to effluent management. We want to ensure that the guidelines use plain English where possible and adopt the use of flowcharts and case studies so all stakeholders involved in the on-farm development process can follow the guidelines or seek help when needed. We hope we will provide farmers with greater confidence to ask the right questions. We understand that these are significant changes to any dairy operation, and input from many different service providers and consultants will be needed. Therefore, farmers need the confidence to ensure they are using suitably qualified people who can provide timely advice and have a comprehensive understanding of the New South Wales Planning and Environmental Regulatory Framework. We want to ensure that we improve assessor knowledge and understanding of modern dairy systems and infrastructure. This will reduce the amount of times councils will need to familiarise themselves with each development application and provide them with a set of guidelines to aid them through the decision process. We want to provide greater flexibility so that these guidelines can be updated in the future. As we all know, the regulatory framework and social licence to operate is constantly changing, so we need to ensure that these guidelines can be easily updated in the future. Lastly, we've already created an internal reference group and have had 2 meetings completed already. We have collected and collated feedback and input from a range of different stakeholders that include farmers, consultants, industry bodies, dairy processors, local council, and other environmental jurisdictions such as the EPA. So where to from now? We have some upcoming consultation events to watch out for. The next phase of the project will be to connect with local councils across the state and dairy and regions to get government insight on how we can improve the development application process for them, while also educating staff on the different types of modern dairy systems and infrastructure that are currently being rolled out across the state. We will also be holding 2 to 3 workshops across the state in areas starting in the Shoalhaven. We will be targeting areas which have recently had the greatest demand for new developments, primarily driven by the changes in climate or extreme weather events. We'll be looking to interact with farmers, contractors, consultants, and other stakeholders who have been a part of recent development processes or are looking to commence one shortly. An online workshop may also occur if demand is present. Finally, we envision this project will highlight some inconsistencies and confusion in the legislative frameworks that determine the DA and environmental protection license assessment and approvals. We hope learnings from this review will enable greater consistency and more streamlined decisions from councils in the future and reduce the overwhelming and complicated processes that farmers experience. And just lastly, for information, please reach out to one of us in the team. And in the meantime, here is the new Dairy Australia feed pad and contained housing resource, which we've mentioned on the call a couple of times. I've also just like to invite Lillian or Zita if they would like to comment on anything further.
Thanks a lot, Blake. Yeah, that's been a great overview. I think also just to mention as well, like, well, yourself and Lillian are the key contacts here in terms of the review of the guidelines in conjunction with Marguerite, but also another project that's coming through over the next 12 to 18 months will be the Navigating Farm Developments project. So I think some of you might be aware, but in Agriculture Victoria, they've got a web-based spatial tool, which kind of really assists farmers in kind of siting and the different overlays on their property, and also kind of an online tool to help them navigate this process. So that will also be being developed in New South Wales. Again, that project's only just starting to kick off now. So once we have more information, we'll be able to update you there. But that will fit very nicely into what's happening with the update with the environmental guidelines as well. But and Blake will be a key contact for that project. Yeah, thanks, Blake. Lillian, do you have anything else to mention or comment, given you're the project lead, or is that all good?
That's all good, thank you.
Thanks, Lillian. Thanks, Blake.
Cool. Did we have any questions from the audience? Cool, no worries. Might have got a cheat round there. Oh, well, that concludes our DPI Dairy Breakfast. Thank you all for joining today. This session has been recorded and will be available on YouTube shortly. If you have any questions after the presentation, please feel free to reach out via email, and we'll also be sending out an email with the YouTube link. But yeah, we'll give you back 10 minutes of your day and enjoy the rest of your Friday.